Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. I'm Peter Limberg, the steward of the Stoa. The Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this very moment. And today we have Tada Hozumi. Tata is a writer and a blogger at Selfish Activist. And I've been appreciator of his work for a while now. And many people have been asking me to invite him on. I think he first came off on my radar when I read an article, White People Can't Dance Because of Trauma. And I didn't know how it landed for me at the time. I was like, if you ever see me dance, it's like a fish that's dying out of water. So there might be truth to that. And today we're going to talk about cultural somatics and how it's going to go. Where it's going to be a one-on-one conversation, and then we're going to pivot to the standard Q&A format. So if you have any questions, throw them in the chat. I'll call on you, unmute yourself, and ask your question. If you don't want to be on YouTube, I will read your question on your behalf. And Tada would like to do a grounding exercise before we engage in a conversation. So I'll tag him in right now, formally welcome him to the Stoa, and yeah, the floor is yours, my friend. And you're on mute.
Hello. Am I in your minds? Yes, you can hear me? Okay. So welcome. My name is Tada Hozumi. I'm a person of the Japanese diaspora living in so-called unceded coastless territories. So that's Vancouver, BC. So invite you, wherever you are, just to give yourself a moment, if you like. You don't have to ground with me, but you know. Just letting your jaws relax. Letting your shoulders drop. Oops. That was too vigorous. Letting any tension in your heart or chest drop. And if it's accessible to you, relaxing your tummy. And you might take a moment to be like, oh, I'm right here, right now. So that might be just listening to the sounds in your environment. You're like, oh. Or taking a look at what you really love. I have a teapot in front of me. I'm gonna have some tea with y'all. So taking a look at that, even touching it feels good. Yeah, and invite folks for a moment just to be like, oh yeah, I am on wherever you are. Just, you know, recognizing the history of the lands of where you are. Maybe you're not even sure. And if you're not sure, you just recognize that you're not sure. You know? So again, like I said, I'm on unceded coastless territories. So that's traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And I'm honored to be here and hope to be a good steward and have a good conversation today with you all.
Cool.
One sec. One sec. It's just letting the tea steep. Do you know what I mean? So invite yourself to steep in it just for a second. A 1 minute infusion. Yes, very well. Thank you.
The title of today, Cultural Somatics, maybe it would be good to talk, because I believe you coined that term, that phrase, maybe talk about how you hold it and how it relates to the work that you do.
Yeah, cultural somatics. Well, it's interesting. If anybody knows Resmaa Menakem, they're you know, a colleague of mine. I'm a somatic therapist consultant, and they do work in racial justice work, racial trauma work. And we actually came to the term independently of each other at this kind of similar time. So yeah, that's cultural somatics. It's kind of a shitty term, to be honest, because I wish it didn't have to be like there's regular somatics and there's cultural somatics. So you're always like kind of like, it's like saying like there's rock and alternative rock, you know? At some point you want it all to be just rock. You know, does that kind of make sense? There's this period of time where you're doing this new thing that's supposed to be counter to the old thing, and it's uncomfortable, but you're like, I don't want to be defined by that. I don't want to be just rock. And that's a little bit where I'm going to, but I digress. So what cultural somatics is this? So if I talk about I'm wondering how to talk. I can talk about the history of it in a long chain of things, or I can talk about it really sharply as a concept. Yeah, which would you prefer, Peter? Sharply as a concept, or the history, kind of the story of it?
I'm a little selfish for both, but what's salient at the moment is the sharpness of the concept.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so that's kind of stoic, isn't it? Okay. I don't even know what it really means, stoic. Okay. So cultural somatics, for me, that's how I process it. Means that groups of people are bodies, right? So we have a body, right, with a nervous system, right, and an unconscious that's tagged into, right? So groups of people are also bodies. That's all. It's a very simple premise. But the reason why this is important is because when you start to see groups of people as bodies, it means that everything you learn in, let's say, one-on-one trauma therapy and stuff like that, counseling, becomes applicable to groups of people as one body, if that makes sense. So this has been like kind of like a lot of people call my work politicized somatics. I don't necessarily think it's that political in some sense. It's like, it's not separate. You know, politics is not this separate thing from medicine or anything else, or healing or therapy. But yeah, what it means then is that like we can understand things like racism, misogyny, and things as trauma itself within a cultural body. Right? Does that start to make sense? So there's a cultural body that is like right now there's a body all between us, let's say, right? But there's a cultural body, and then it functions almost basically exactly like our individual body. But what happens is in this larger cultural body, the trauma of that shows up as things like racism, misogyny, and things like that. And then we perceive those things as systemic, but actually what they are is their trauma behaviors captured inside of like the organism of this larger collective. So that's the basic idea. And the reason why this is so helpful is that, you know, like with activism, we're always trying to like, how are you supposed to do this? We have disagreements like this is the way, this is the way, this is the way. But it gives us a little bit more guidance because we're like, oh, okay. So we actually do have like some kind of understanding, better understanding of how to deal with these like an individual change, like an individual's change, like conflict resolution in terms of individual healing as an individual. We understand that. So what it allows us to do is scale everything up. And the most helpful thing probably is that we're recognizing cultures as having nervous systems. So cultures actually go through this ebb and flow that a nervous system does. And a lot of what politics and, you know, is actually the tracking and guiding and, you know, messing around with this nervous system, or maybe not even messing around, but going for the ride, right? We see these kind of things, and that becomes really, really interesting, applicable. Like a typical example, let's say, is like there's something called I call the peak value recovery pattern. Okay, so this is something I made up, but what is actually called the action potential, but it's kind of a shitty name because it's very scientific. But what it is, it's the shape of a single neuron firing off. Okay, and this is something that was kind of shown to me by a colleague named Dr. Teresa Mateus, who's like a POC activist, somatic therapist, and she was kind of like, oh, so we have is like, so a single neuron looks like this, right? Boom. That's how a single neuron fires off, right? Potential, 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 threshold, whoa, peak, whoa, valley, whoa, recovery. Right? So one of the things that Dr. Matea saw was she was emotional first aid personnel at Standing Rock, and saw that activist communities actually go through these bounces, thresholds. So there's like something happens, boom, like people are gathering, and then boom, drop. And this is the part that people don't talk about. There's like depression, there's suicidality, all kinds of stuff happen, burnout, and then there's a slow recovery process after, right? And generally speaking, we only talk about this part and don't really realize this part's happening, but it does happen. And I think in general, cultural somatics as a kind of general field of practice and movement is paying a lot more attention to the, oh, wait a second, there's this whole nervous system thing that we go through. We have to actually really adjust how we're doing things, like on a socio-political level, cultural level, to that understanding. So whether it's creating a business, whether it's launching a political campaign, any of these things are affected by this boom. And this is a basic rhythm of life. You know, like when you fall in love with somebody, you're like, oh, kiss, you're the best, oh my god, and then like, oh my god, I hate you, no, I don't want to be with you, and they're like, okay, actually we're gonna mature and actually have a real relationship now. Wait a second, you're a human being? I didn't know that. Right? So that's the peak valley recovery. It exists in orgasm, it exists in exercise, it exists when you eat food, exists in cultural movements. So it exists small and big. So cultural somatics really comes down to understanding this fractal relationship that exists in the world, right? So that's why it's called cultural somatics as opposed to just somatics, because just somatics mean just of the body and just means this individual body. But when you add cultural, it means like, oh, culture is a body. But I mean, again, it's kind of like rock and alternative rock. And I eventually just want it all to be all rock in the sense I'm not hanging on to cultural somatics as a word to ensure its survival in this definite angst towards the mainstream somatics institution. Like, I think this kind of collective responsibility it calls into, I think is really important. I wouldn't want to shortchange that. So, I really think because of that, in some ways, like cultural somatics, I actually really like cultural somatic. So that's like as a adverb or adjective, So like these are like cultural somatic experiences you can have. Like we can start with a really grimy one, which I love, is like Ted Bundy is a serial killer. So when Ted was, when you watch his documentary, you realize that Ted was having visions as a kid, right? These like women being murdered and stuff like that, and he made it his own individual experience. But something we actually don't talk about is that something that European governments and Western governments have been doing on a governmental level for 200 years, right? Through the witch hunts and witch trials, right? And so I would say that's a cultural somatic phenomenon where Ted is actually channeling something from this larger experience, but we don't have a language for it. But it's a cultural somatic phenomenon that we think is individual, but actually his behavior and his actions are a lot more like this collective field. And all politics is cultural somatic. Like like Donald Trump was a cultural somatic being. I can tell you almost every person that votes for him has a father in their family like that, or has that family pattern in their family tree that they're resonating with, and that's why they're voting for Donald. It's not even just politics. And that's a cultural somatic phenomenon, because it's like everybody's individual kind of family attachment dynamic. Yeah, we call that daddy issues. Yeah, exactly. This and the specific flavor of father issues, actually, right? This tyrannical, and Donald has his own father is like that. So this is very like the Ted Bundy example makes me think Alex Manassa. Oh yeah. That's like a very cultural. A lot of that stuff is cultural somatic phenomenon. What we call spirit possession. So what elder cultures called spirit possession, you can call it cultural somatic phenomenon. That was a bit of a ramble with some like grimy examples, like Donald Trump and Ted. Not the some unsavory influence, but yeah, here we are.
Two questions.
Yeah.
So people start putting your questions in the chat now if you have any that are live. Two terms it'd be interesting to unpack, or I'm curious to unpack, is the cultural dissociation and then trauma diversity. And maybe also I've studied the culture war, and it's sort of like from a meta perspective, and how trauma relates to the kind of the cultural warring that's happening in our society.
I love it. So cultural dissociation. Yeah. So one of the things that's been kind of poverty is that a lot of this language that we've developed around understanding things like, what people call privilege. So racial privilege, like white privilege, male privilege and stuff. The ontology of the word and concept around privilege is really, it's like explaining the experience of human beings to institutions, right? So that's kind of like the context. So there's a lot of like benefit to it, but it's not really explaining humans to humans, if that makes sense, right? It's a really institutional conversation. And so what I find is useful is to go a little bit more human to human and really use what I call like neurological language. So when we understand that, okay, so culture has trauma, right? And the activities, or sorry, behaviors that come out of that trauma are things like racism and stuff, things we don't like. Of course, then that body has some kind of dissociation from that traumatic material, right? A lot of it is ancestral trauma material. In the case of white men, it's deeply related to like European imperial society that we never talk about. So pre-colonial imperial society, Europe was a horrible place to be in. Like people were being tortured in squares, right? This is like the reality of Europe, like in the pre-medieval ages, plagues everywhere. Like it was not a fun place to be, right? Population gets wiped out multiple times. Not cool, not fun. So when there's that kind of trauma, it's natural for us to experience dissociation. And so what we understand as privilege, right, in the world is actually what you might call dissociation. Because if you see the culture as a body, that must be a body phenomenon. So what dissociation then is a kind of comfort that protects you from having to process trauma that comes from really realizing what you're living in. So what white and male and all these privileges are actually forms of dissociativeness. So you're like, because you're like, it's like these financial comforts and stuff are there, institutional comforts are there to protect a certain kind of processing of trauma and realizing a certain kind of reality of the world. Like, wait a second, the climate is collapsing, like all this stuff like protects you from that. Because if you're a less privileged person, you would have realized all that shit a while ago. You're like, yeah, no, shit's been fucked. Like you get it, but you're at last have to realize that. And so I call that cultural dissociation because I think it's just more real, and it also explains more the behavior. So yes, privilege equals the matrix equals dissociation. Yeah. The matrix is like a dissociative mechanism. So that's exactly the one of the most easiest ways to understand it. So what you have is like, then you'll notice that when you attack privilege, you generally get what you expect out of people protecting their dissociation. And that's what's problematic about it. It's not that social inequity would, without dissociation, this cultural dissociation would just be an inequity of distribution, which is normal. You drop a bunch of marbles, they're going to land, some are going to have less, some are going to have, closer to each other. There's natural distribution and randomness. Everybody wants different things. Like some people want to live in a little shack by the sea. Some people want a little bit more elaborate living. It's just a random trial, right? What makes it malignant is that it's actually a dissociative mechanism that's protecting some kind of traumatic behavior. Right? So that's, I think, the key thing. And there's still the trauma diversity piece, but should I pause there to kind of like, look at the chat and see if there's any interesting questions?
the questions are going to be coming from all over the place. So
Okay.
maybe we will double click on the trauma diversity, and then we'll pivot to the questions.
Okay. Yeah. So trauma diversity. So this is kind of like me joking around a little bit. I'll be honest with y'all. Again, like intersectionality has really been a big language for us to understand oppression, right? Over the last like kind of like 5-10 years, right? Intersectionality, brought by Kimberly Crenshaw. So again, like I think really useful term, especially when you're talking about like law, policy, and stuff like that. But one of the weaknesses I found is people have been using intersectionality to navigate their relationships in a way that probably actually, like that was not necessarily predicted. That was not the original use. It was meant to like explain people to institutions, because Kimberly Crenshaw was a lawyer. So it's about explaining what is experience of this, of like, let's say a Black woman who has this intersectional identity, and you're explaining that to the courts, explain that to like, law students. That was the context, right? And it's got exported outside of that. So I was kind of like, I don't know if that actually really works that well. So what I've been kind of like working with is an idea. One is that this is a little bit more like the magical woo-woo stuff in my work, but trauma as a being. So, it's kind of like an indigenous systemic way of thinking, animistic, to think of trauma as being, as like an entity, right? And the part I really enjoy about understanding trauma as an entity that, maybe it's a creepy crawly or whatever, right, is that you get to apply like a biodiversity model. Does that make sense? Right. So because trauma has similarities, it's going to act in certain ways. Like all dogs do certain things, right? But when you actually look at the species dog, or I don't know if it's species, but whatever, the category of animal dog that can all mate with each other and create new babies, right? Each one has its own unique little imprint, each little variation category, right? And I think trauma is a lot like that. So instead of like conceiving, let's say, you are, a Chinese woman, so you have this intersectional identity of being Chinese and being a woman, and then you have like a white man who's gay. Well, let's see, this person is more privileged here, this person is more like, this gets into this really entangled logical dynamic, and it turns into this kind of like what the culture wars talk about as like kind of this identity politicking, oppression Olympics, kind of like one-upping, playing the race card, playing the gay card, playing the playing cards, right? It's like, it's kind of turns into like this intersection Yu-Gi-Oh, right? And so I feel like actually a more like real understanding is like there's biodiversity. So you're gonna, let's say you're a white dude, cis white dude, maybe middle class, whatever, you actually have a very particular kind of cultural trauma that lives in your body, very particular actually, right? And then you have your own lineage in your own life, but there's this biodiversity, right? And then let's say you're like a Black woman, you have this biodiverse expression of that trauma that's really about your body, about your culture, like your positionality, your upbringing, right? And so I think there's a little bit more like this kind of like fascination of, oh, there's all these different species and each one is unique, and then you can also categorize, and that's actually a lot, I think, closer to what actually how trauma functions in a person's life. And because I think when you get into intersectionality, a lot of people turned it into like essentially how do you gain power in using this dialogue. Whereas I think if you take like a strictly trauma-based lens, you'd be like, oh no, actually there's this certain kind of trauma that you have and certain kind of trauma I have, and there's a way that interacts, and it's a very unique, and we're going to get to know it. I don't know, I'm not more eloquent at this moment. I might even have to pull up my own language around it, but I think it's just like it's just more true, and it's easy because, oh yes, so the thing that's helpful is about trauma diversity instead of intersectionality in this case is that when you recognize it's this biodiversity of trauma that people have, right, and resource, but we'll stick with trauma for now, is that allows you to go like, oh, but what's similar is fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and all the trauma responses. So you can easily track those, right? So you're not getting pulled into like, oh, is it do I, somebody called me racist and I'm white. Do I need to listen to this person? That gets into a lot of like self-doubt and kind of like crazy talk itself, where it's a lot easier to go like, what's the trauma response I'm having? Am I going to fight or flight or freeze or fawn? What's happening to the other person? Are they going to trauma response? Are they going to fight, flight, freeze? Like, that's actually, so there's some actual common denominator that we can start tracking that I find really, really useful. And I don't know. And this, I mean, to get it to be really useful, I think there needs to be a little bit of more like trauma-based kind of psychology knowledge that we're basing that on. But once you get there, it feels like, yeah, a lot of situations have become a lot easier to understand, if that makes sense. Because what you're trying to do is reduce trauma response behavior, right? Does that make sense?
Right. And the
Yeah,
key,
yeah, that's what we're trying to reduce. Yeah.
yeah, and the key thing there was it's like healing too, right? Where you said the latter one, if it's more intellectual, is about how to manipulate it to get power, and then this one was about sort of healing the collective trauma.
Yeah, and I mean, that could be a bit simplistic. I'm not saying the intersectionality should be thrown out, but it's just more like, I think a trauma lens or like a neurology-based lens makes more sense when we're talking about humans to humans, because that's what we are. When we're explaining people to institutions, then you start getting into like, yeah, like, like if you're tracking like child poverty rates, yeah, probably good to have intersectionality in mind. So you're tracking for different communities and how they're, you know what I mean? Like, you're not just going like women and men, like you'd be like, oh, Black women. Okay. Like you want to like have that kind of mind to collect the data and process it, right? That's intersectionality, I think, is very useful for that type of schematic. But for me relating to you or anybody else on this call, I think it falls apart quite quickly unless you have skill. Yeah, that's my thought.
All right, let's go to the Q&A. Aditya, if you can unmute yourself.
I really appreciate you and your work. Yeah, thank you so much for coming here.
Oh, thank you.
It was a breath of fresh air. I heard, I think, a podcast with you a few months ago on a Patreon page. I can't remember. And I shared it with a bunch of people. I want to share just a minute background and then a question. Me and maybe some others of us on this call have gone to Robin DiAngelo racial justice workshops, and I'm sure lots of people have read her work. So the experience on the intellectual side was like super incisive, like wonderfully, incisive critique of like us and what we're doing. But the kind of effect of that was different. There's a group of 100 people, half POC, half white bodies. And I would say, amongst the white bodies, there's a kind of like traumatization, shame, and maybe some of that was very productive in the end. And amongst the POCs, there was, the mixes of those things and also empowered, a kind of righteous anger. And then over the 2 or 3 days of the workshop, the two groups just like, totally lost faith in interacting with each other. And, the POC group, I think, formed a lot of bonds. I wasn't in the white groups. I don't know exactly how they, I tried to follow up with some of them. But my hit from that workshop was just that, wow, the like academic incisive critique is different than the actual effect on the body. And maybe what's happening in these bodies, is totally, some levels productive, some levels totally counterproductive to the ideals or the goals of the critique in the first place. It's, as I was thinking about this, and I appreciate you and your work, my body's literally shaking. Like my 2019 was kind of spent as a good racial justice activist, the best I could be. I mean, I'm sure I failed in so many ways. And then this year was kind of like, I kind of like fled to the meta modern, whatever, post activist, post humanist, whatever. Yeah, so there's that map in me. Yeah, thanks for making that shape as well. So yeah, I was just literally, I was shaking in my hips and my knees and my belly, and I think there's an excitement as well, for a kind of synthesis and a hope, for some way of, so the action, the question I could ask is like, what's a better way forward, to really bring in the body in these kind of like academic incisive critiques from racial justice people who have had real trauma. But then I think there's a deeper question of like, like what do we do now? Something like that, that's bubbling in my body that I just want to welcome, even though it doesn't have words.
Yeah, no, thank you. And how do I pronounce your name again?
Aditya.
Aditya?
Yeah.
I fucked up, didn't I? Aditya?
That's pretty good. How
Okay,
about
all
you?
right.
Can I pronounce your name better?
Yeah, go ahead. Give it a shot.
Tadaki?
Yeah, it's kind of there.
Yeah.
We're probably at the same level.
Can you say yours just so I can hear it once?
Oh yeah, Tadaki.
Tadaki. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I mean, what can we do? Yeah, that's a really, yeah. So you had that. What I'm hearing is like you had that really deep sensitization to racial trauma, and then your response in 2020. You said modern, so that almost sounds a little bit dissociating. You're actually like, it's like you're going into soothing distance, a distance away from the work where you can soothe yourself, and just could be some slight dissociative qualities in that. And dissociation is not always bad, just so you know, right? Like dissociation is sometimes what allows you to like, it's kind of like when you're having a bad day and you're watching Netflix and you're like, oh, this show is really good. So you're not like fully engaged in what you're worrying about, So there is that quality, right? It's about being able to first not act in a violent way from a dissociated place, and also being able to unfreeze when it's appropriate. These are the qualities that are important, right? So yeah, I love the thing you talk about synthesis, because I think, yeah, you're talking about that whole kind of like mimetic. I don't know if people are familiar with mimetics, but like this whole process of there being a thesis, antithesis, and then the synthesis. And this is like rock, alternative rock, and rock rock now, you know what I mean? It's, yeah, like there's thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. It's always a part of our ideation process. And I feel like, Aditya, you're like talking about like, oh yeah, what is the synthesis, right? You're going into like, this like really maybe academically driven form of understanding, and then there's this kind of meta modernity, and then you're like, wait, post-activism, and then you're like, what is this next thing that's coming? And in a way, post-activism, I think there's a synthesis type of quality there already. And I definitely think always about acting as synthesis. I have a strong antithesis side of me, but I'm still trying to see forward to the synthesis. And yeah, what would I say immediately? There is, so one thing is that what we might pay more attention to is, people, if you follow people like Adrienne Marie Brown, she's already been talking about stuff like this, but following the subtle work that's done, like understanding the relationship between the subtle and the larger impact. I don't know, I think I made this whole conversation boring by saying this, but it's like, so generally speaking, when a political movement catalyzes a big moment, right, and a person that kind of like grabs, or select few people that grab the reins, and this huge thing happens, right? What's less talked about is kind of like what's happening behind the scenes has been building up this possibility for a very long period of time. So what's been creating this potential, right? And I think that synthesis is a lot more understanding of this relationship between the big thing that's happening and the subtle thing that's building potential. And this is a really somatic process. This is a body process of understanding. One of the ways that we can look at it is, let's say, like, if you look at the civil rights movement, let's say, the Black civil rights movement, you're going to have like pivotal people and pivotal moments that epitomize what happened. And when we go back in history, we're like, oh, this happened, this date here, this person, right? Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, we start tracking these people and doing really important work, which is totally true, right? The thing that we have less capacity to track, though, are things like the little neighborhood movements and things like that were happening at the same time a little bit before that. So for me, I'm a dancer, and the things that I really love to talk about and think about is like, so there's these big political movements, but a lot of the foundation for those political movements to exist are probably parties. So a lot of, poor Black folks working in cities would do these things called red parties, and essentially host gambling and music and stuff at their house to make the rent. And it's actually this kind of stuff that happened in neighborhoods that actually we don't realize has a lot more to do with the network and creating the fabric that gives the potential later for that thing to go off. It creates this like kind of resiliency, right? That allows this thing later to take off. And so I think a cultural somatic approach is to understand that like both of these have to be aware of each other. Like these processes have to be aware of each other, because when you look at the kind of academic process, it's a lot more that like analytical, this happened, this thing here, da, 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 da. And then there's this whole other layer that's a lot more of a subtle movement. These little things like, doing parties together and da, 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 right? So, even in the case of like, Robin's work, I don't actually know her work that well. I've had some critiques of it, and I've also had some like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But it's a little bit casual. But even in terms of like racial equity work, there's a level at which there's that like racial awareness, like you bring people in, you talk about white fragility, there's that layer. And then there's the other layer of like just, going for food, dating each other. Like actually that's a huge thing. Like, I can't, intercultural relationships. It's actually a lot of that stuff that actually provides the foundation for the other thing to happen. So there's something about, I think when I think about synthesis, is just this aspect of being aware that like the people who are doing, it's like people who have multiple awareness and are actually able to cultivate both are really, really valuable. And I think that's kind of like where we're going to. And that has a lot to do with like undoing celebrity, this kind of myth of the single individual and single moments that catalyze things, like so much attention paid to that, because I think the important work happens really behind the scenes subtly. That's what's actually most of it, is this subtle work that's happening. In some sense, Robin's work is part of the subtle, of course, right? Because it is that kind of like individual capacity building. But even then, there's always other levels of like, I don't know if I'm, this is that exciting a conversation, but the one way I would put it though, and this will bring you into a really cultural somatic conversation, is if, I don't know if you folks are familiar with like energy work, but you can make it simple, just like kind of like really touch-based work that's healing work. Like, and it's not even just massage, it's just like moving subtle fluid around in the body, like osteopathy or cranial sacral therapy or qigong, right? So the principle of all that work is the subtle informs the dense. So you move something at the subtle level, and then dense things happen. So let's say like you're like, oh, somebody's spine is like a bit frozen. You're like, okay, spine, I'm gonna send a little bit of warmth there. I'm gonna pay attention to you. And the spine starts moving. You're like, okay, so maybe it's like the sacrum or something. And then you're like, oh, okay, cool. That little thing might have an effect later in their life. Maybe a few days down the road, they're like, I need to break up with this person I'm codependent with. So that's the approach that cultural somatics takes, is that kind of like, okay, yeah, okay. And then kind of something happens that's out of that's bigger, but it's not necessarily like perfectly designed to make that thing happen. Does that make sense? It's this subtle like, and then you're like, oh, that happened because of that. Yeah. So that's kind of like, I don't know if that answers the question, but it's part of it, I think. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Lara, you had a question.
Hi. Just so you know, there's some somatic people here that moonlight as Stoics. So.
Oh, really? Who are the somatic people?
I'm one of them.
Well, I mean, did you?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Lara. Okay.
So I'm a somatic practitioner, and I have aspirations. I mean, I've worked with groups, I've done some pretty wild work with groups, and I have aspirations to do more trauma work with groups. And I guess my question is like, how do we tend to this body level, this nervous system level, in like really practical, real world ways together?
What does practical and real world mean,
Well,
though?
I guess I'm curious the praxis for cultural somatics. So like, what does it look like when you're doing the praxis of cultural somatics in the world?
That's really interesting. Yeah. Okay. All right. So, you have a practice, Lara?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think, man, I'm just gonna make everything simple and boring. Like, I think it's like, so you have a practice, right? And then you see your clients, right? And that's the somatics part that's really obvious, right? Like you're doing one-on-one somatics work, therapeutic work, and then the cultural somatic part is just how you run your business, I think. Which is a little bit bigger, right? And the client never interacts with it. And a lot of people don't see it, but it's about how you charge money. It's about like who you talk to, who you converse with. It's like the subtlety and the speed at which you build your business, because that's a nervous system thing, if that makes sense, right? So that's actually the simple part. And a lot of it's like how to run decent organizations and organize well as a community. And it's, so if you're like a somatic therapist, the individual work that you'd be doing is the somatics part. That's really obvious. And then the cultural somatic part is, it's like how you follow up with clients, how you build your groups, how fast you build your relationships, how fast you open your practice, where you decide to open your practice. The subtle layer, yeah. Did that kind of, I feel like you're nodding your head, so it landed something.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful and interesting and going to be really fun to play with. And is helping me understand cultural somatics better, because I imagine cultural somatics. Well, I know someone that's done your training and is going to work with a group of mine. And so I was just imagining it mostly as like group work. But I hear this like whole other layer.
No.
That
Oh,
you're
actually,
offering.
no, it's interesting. I actually don't consider cultural somatics like the biggest it's not actually group work. It's not even individual work. It's like how you live your life a little bit like that. A lot of my interest in is actually how to run organizations. So it's about working with bigger bodies. So a group has a bigger body, right? But it's kind of like you're doing somatics without telling people, but you're doing in the context of this, like a nonprofit has a body, and a client comes to me who runs a nonprofit. I'm like, okay, so the nonprofit is a body, and their brain just came to me and going like, I'm having some trouble. That's essentially how I conceive of it. So the nonprofit director is like the brain, or somebody might be the conscience. Somebody might be like a middle manager, but like there's some shit happening, I don't know how to deal with it. It's like, okay, so you're like a part of the psyche of this organization that's going like, something's off. So like, okay, let me support you as you being a part of this larger body. That's actually the framing. So that's kind of like, that's what that's a lot of my work, a lot of my most fun work. And so it's not necessarily just in group work, but it's like taking it's working with cultures. I think at the most kind of like meta level, it's working with cultures directly. And that means, how you participate, let's say in your client community, how you charge people, how you talk to people, how fast you return emails, all that stuff is part of cultural somatics to me. Yeah. Working with culture. I don't know. Chris.
That's so cool. I love applying the nervous system to everything. So thank you for that.
It's applying the nervous system to everything.
I have one quick follow-up question, which is, how would you differentiate like a cultural body versus just a field?
I mean, they're the same thing. I know what
Okay.
you mean. It's the
Yeah,
same thing.
okay.
It's just so that for everybody who's following, field is kind of like this complex web. I mean, how would you describe a field?
Yeah, the intersubjective, transsubjective, complex web, energetic space. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So yeah, like yeah, the cultural body is exactly that. Because our organism is a network of beings, right? It's a network, it's an electronic network hooked up with all this like shooting around. Same thing. And the simple way to conceive it is, you know, Carl Jung talked about there being a collective unconscious. One of the things he did less of is though is talk about that this collective unconsciousness actually having a body. So actually having a body that goes into fight, flight, freeze, and has nervous system responses. So that's kind of like the way I conceive of it. And of course, the collective unconscious is exactly this field. So I think that's one way to, yeah, understand it. Mm-hmm. Yep, you do.
All right. Evan, you had a question.
Scroll up real quick to get to it. It was quite a ways up the thread. So my question for you, and I really appreciate your work and love the perspective that you're bringing to this. I also am a bit of a somatic practitioner, though not for pay. So I really appreciate that lens you brought with the body and the nervous system. So along those lines, I want to ask if you can speak to perhaps the potential origins of cultural trauma as part of what I might phrase the aftershocks of the trauma of human domestication as we moved into cities and away from our ancestral ways of being, because I sense a connection there. And I also wonder what ways you might suggest would allow us to still live in large scale societies without inflicting so much trauma on each other and on the cultural body.
Small question. Okay. Yeah, no, I think about that a lot. I mean, I think we all think about that a lot, probably. Yeah. So, yes, I think a lot. I don't know if I track the domestication of human beings as being the pivotal trauma, but I think it's one of the images we have of our primary ancestral trauma, right? So one thing you could imagine first, I think, is that, so if cultures are bodies, they obviously outlive our bodies, right? We die, but cultures live on, right? And they have a developmental phase that's a lot longer, right? So when you realize cultures are people, you start to realize that, you know how, you know, whatever, you know, fuckery that happened in your childhood affects how we behave in the present in our relationships. That's what cultures do, right? So when culture has trauma on its origin, it behaves in screwed up ways later, especially when it gains power, right? So that's a lot of what you call white supremacy and patriarchy either. So it's some kind of trauma at an earlier point in life, and then that becomes expressed in behavior later, right? So this is the question I think Evan's asking around ancestral trauma that's really like pertinent. So yeah, of course, when you recognize these things are trauma behaviors, you start to ask like, oh, what's the origins of that? And I think tracking that, yeah, the humans living in big cities and stuff like that, being this primary trauma, I think it's one of them. I think it's definitely one of them. I think I do caution us against like trying to get to this idyllic past though, because for a lot of people that's not going to exist. It's not like the natural state of humans living in the wild is like that much fun, probably. You know, like think about us like being thrown into whatever natural environment that we're in right now, and it gets overrun by the natural environment that exists, and we don't have any clothes. That's probably not fun for human beings. So I think I want to like move away a little bit from that. And I think it's also, I think it's natural for, it's a part of human nature to evolve the way that we have. Like this kind of way of creating cities and things like that. It is actually natural for us. I just want to put it, it's a part of our natural evolution, I think. So I don't want to make it, I don't want to create this nature human dichotomy that's so strong. That's kind of like a big part of Western thought. I'm not really into that. I tend to see nature and human as kind of fractal and interchangeable and fluid in between each other. And, you know, that includes like creating tools, and that includes maybe our domestication, right? So So I don't want to create that sharp of a line, but I do think we are in a place, let's say that, and of course at certain points in our history, certain people in certain places have had a pretty good life. They're like, oh, we actually kind of figured it out. It's been pretty good here. And then somebody invades, you're like, fuck, that sucked, and then goes to shit again, right? You know what I mean? There's like pockets of time and place probably where things are like super good. And then you have disturbance from whatever outside that people, like maybe people got flooded, so they're scarce and traumatized, and they're like, hey, neighbor, look at all your resources, fuck you. And then, right, and then this kind of like spirals, right? What I would say, if you look at the general course of history, though, we've been coming out of like, there's this kind of, we've been generally coming out of this kind of imaginative childhood place into a kind of like, what do you call, like, there's been a succession of trauma that's been built up that people have become very intellectual. We've become a very intellectual species. That's a part of the colonial process, right? The Enlightenment and colonialism, you can't disconnect from each other. So, the Cartesian idea that I think, therefore I am, obviously has no body attached to it. And that's like the epitome of that, right? Like, it's not I sense my body, so I am present. It's like, no, I think, therefore I am. It's like literally a brain in a vat. I have my thoughts. I'm like, okay, so that's interesting. So if you imagine that we're a species that have, generally speaking, moved towards more and more frozenness, right? And then so we've become more and more cut off, and our cognitive function becomes higher and higher, right? Because this is just getting reinforced. So a lot of this technology is about like trying to create safety and like securing. This is scary, secure, right? And what I would say is that it's very simple. I think, all trauma has gifts. The fact that I'm here on this call with everybody, this is a gift. Is this part of like the white colonial legacy and modern enlightenment? Absolutely, 100%. So part of it is like, I think this is part of the culture war piece too, is to like, like, there is some level of like kind of recognizing the gifts that this traumatic process has been a part. There are gifts in this traumatic process. There are things that we will keep, and we don't want to get too nihilistic about that. And this is kind of a hard way to think about it. It's like, oh, you mean like white colonialism had benefits? Like, it's more like, yeah, when we're looking at it in an oppositional way, that becomes really like weird and funky. But if you just look at it, okay, so we're one body and we're experiencing this traumatized thing, then of course, whatever traumatic adaptations we made, the gifts of that, part of trauma healing is keeping those gifts and undoing the poor behavior. This is the thing, right? So yeah, I think the simple answer is, yeah, I can see a future like that. And I think that is the healing. I think we tend to get way too nihilistic about like, well, we need to smash the patriarchy. And it's like, yeah, we do kind of need to dismantle white supremacy and smash patriarchy. But I tend to want to move towards, like, if you have a solution rather than an antithesis, I think it's going to be a lot easier process for a lot of people. I think the people who are, let's say, the early adopters, it's different, or innovators. They're happy to go in and smash everything because they're happy to be in the nothingness and figure out new things. But if you want to bring on like the early majority and the late adopters or whatever, late majority, like you need to actually be orienting towards like, oh, there's actually a way out without like totally totally destroying everything that's present. And I think that's what a lot of the culture wars are about. You know what I mean? Is about like people feeling like, oh, are you saying that everything that white men have done is bad? And then people are like, yes. And we're like, and then like listening, kind of going like, yeah, okay. So this is going to get into a huge power struggle, because the reality is though, like, there's a lot of value to retain from white men have done. Like, that's a part of our cultural trauma, and we do need to keep its gifts, or else that's not actually trauma healing. That's nihilism and self-harm, actually, as a culture, as an overall culture. So this is a big part of it. And I think this is the part that, rubs people the wrong way, because it gets into thinking that's like, wait a second, like we do have to be nice to white guys and keep Donald Trump in power. It's like, no, you don't have to do that. And those are two different conversations, right? So there's two different layers at which things are happening, two different cultural somatic levels. One is very meta, the other very, other is like more specific. So this kind of bouncing around is important. And this is I think a thing that's I think that's harder to track. But so yeah, do I think will there be a future where or to design a future where we get to keep the benefits of modernity? And yeah, I mean, part of it is just learning to slow down. It's a nervous system thing, so we're not in this dependency. In the empire, we've been managing our trauma with a dependency, and I don't always, I don't say addiction is bad or necessarily in the sense that it's always a coping mechanism. I think there's compassion that we need to extend and work with it and even see it as resiliency. But, there's also addiction and power, dependency and power, not a good combo. And, the empire runs on Diet Coke, right? Like Donald Trump consumes like 15 to 20 Diet Cokes a day. Jordan Peterson consumes about like 10 Diet Cokes a day. And so it's like the empire runs that on caffeine, and I kind of somewhat like Jordan Peterson at times, but that's neither here nor there. But I think it's important and interesting to track the nervous systems that are part of this kind of general sphere of like kind of what is happening around us. And this, the white colonialism in and of itself, right? What we call white imperialism, white colonialism, the British Empire and all these other empires extending. The major reason why colonialism really played out is to secure stimulants for white people. Does that land? It's a cocaine, Coca-Cola, sugar, wheat, caffeine through tea, coffee, heroin, tobacco. I can keep going. So it really actually the empire that we see around the world is driven to secure stimulants that maintain dependency and maintain dissociation from trauma. So I think it's interesting that Donald Trump consumes as much Diet Coke as he does. I was like, that's a really ridiculous number. And I was like, oh, I was watching Jordan Peterson's documentary. I was like, oh my God, you consume a lot of Diet Coke. It's not really about your ideas. It's your nervous system that's kind of like whacked out, dude. You know what I mean? Like that explains a lot, I think. A lot of what's happening. I think it's really funny. So I think, yeah. So if there's a future where we're drinking less Diet Coke, I think that's the way to go. And I think that's what we really designed for. It's really simple, Mm-hmm. And a universal basic income, I'd say, is a part of that. Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Very cool.
Everyone's giving me a lot of thumbs up, so I like it.
All right, so we're at the top of the hour, and we have an event actually right now. So, Tada, any closing thoughts that you had for us that you'd like to leave us with?
Oh, you have an event, like you're having a tea party, or?
It's called Shame Breakthrough Bootcamp event. So it's on a different link. I don't know.
Oh, is there like another thing happening in the next second or something?
Yeah, it's okay. It's a different link, so people can jump on in a moment. But
oh, okay.
We're gonna close out here now.
Oh, okay. What do you want me to do? Like summarize?
Any kind of thoughts you'd like to leave us with, where we can find?
Yeah. Since I talked about UBI really quickly, because I think Stoics like talking about economics. I think some kind of economic measure to give everybody a level of economic stability. And that's psychological economic stability, right? It's not about the money. It's about everybody knowing they can receive a certain amount of safety every month and a resource that they know they can do something with. If you look at it, it's kind of like when you arrive at a therapist office and you're like, hey, can we ground? Let me give your body stability. It's called building a secure base. Like, I think, so for me, like, well, when people ask, what does cultural somatics looks like practically?
a lot of it looks like that, like advocating for things like UBI then, that makes sense on a cultural somatic level, like, oh, the body of the culture that we need and needs some kind of scaffolding emotionally. So let's advocate for financial structures that that provide that. And and this creates a subtle new politic, which is not the same as your traditional leftist politics, because the trauma-informed politics is not about like, oh, are you hurt there? Okay, let me help you there. Are you hurt there? Let me help. It's like, oh, okay, so you have shoulder pain. You have, okay, that means your liver is kind of fucked up. If your liver is kind of fucked up, you probably have this kind of trauma. Okay, that probably connects you to your spine. Okay, I can see your sacrum. It's a little bit, okay, so let me apply some heat there. Let me put a needle in your, here, a few spots here and there. That's the kind of socioeconomic, political, I think, kind of thinking that we need to move towards. And yeah, I think a big part of it is advocating for political candidates who can think that way too. So I think we'll see really, it was really interesting to watch Andrew Yang and Marianne Williamson in this kind of last 2020 race in 2019. I think we're going to, in the future, going to see a lot more of those kinds of folks actually running and actually getting office, who actually have this kind of like meta kind of systems thinking type brains. And so I think that's going to be really interesting. That's something I'm really looking forward to. So Laura, I mean, maybe you'll run for office. Yeah, you're thinking that? Okay. Yeah, everybody's like, yeah, no, so yeah, the cultural somatic thing to do is probably run for office. All right, thank you, everybody.
Awesome, thank you. So I'll make some announcements in a moment, but thanks so much for coming to the Stoa, Tada. We'd love to have you back. Our next event is now at Shame Breakthrough Bootcamp. There's a link with AJ Bond. It's the last he's our shame educator, and this is our last one for the month. And then he's back in January. Tomorrow, I'm really excited about this event. Frank Yang, Fully Shredded and Fully Enlightened, Adventures of an Infinite Bra. That's going to be something a little different, 8 p.m. Eastern time. Excited for that. And if you have any more, want to check out other sessions, support us on Patreon, Substack, all those links are there. That being said, everyone, thanks for coming to the show today.